So we think that the harpsichord making goes back to the late medieval period. We don't actually know. The oldest harpsichord in the world is actually at the Smithsonian Institute, so it's still there, and which is from I think it's 1519 to be exact. Anyway, the harpsichord was. Old harpsichords don't tend to last very long because they weren't made to last in perpetuity, and they were a utilitarian instrument, and the purpose was to help provide sound in the court originally for dancing. So if you were someone like Henry VIII, then you owned all the instruments of the people who played for you. So people didn't own their own instruments typically. Maybe they own a fiddle, but the middle class didn't exist in the medieval period and the early Renaissance. So it was just the nobility and peasants. And the peasants would not have had a harpsichord. Only the nobilities would have had the harpsichord, and they would have had many of them. They would have had several organs. We know that Henry VIII had 7 organs and 50 violins, and on it goes. I mean, so he had to have all these instruments for all the people that he employed. So what was the harpsichord used for? It was used to help the lively merriment of the court, which means dancing. Dancing was very much part and parcel to how people enjoyed and experienced music. The concept of sitting down with your hands folded and listening to somebody perform is something that didn't exist outside the church until the 19th century, or maybe 18th. And so in the church, of course, we have the opportunity to hear choral music or monastic plainsong music, and that was open to everybody, peasants, of course, as well as the upper classes. And the organ started to be used in the church basically after the Reformation, and the purpose of it was what? What happened at the Reformation that was maybe the most significant for worship?
The language changed.
Language changed, but didn't affect music.
The hymns?
Hymns, exactly. Congregations started singing hymns. That was the first time in history in the Christian church. Before then, it was only the monastic community that sang. And everybody else listened and experienced through oral education, A-U-A-R, instead of O-R-A-L. So as the organ started to be used in church to accompany hymns, that eventually would lead to, by the Baroque period, what became known as Bach cantatas and other cantatas by Telemann, Buxtehude, all these composers, mostly from Germany, where the Protestant Reformation had first taken root. And as they were using the organ to accompany the cantatas, they also used other instruments. So they started to bring the ideas from the court. I told you that originally the organ and the harpsichord were used to help dancing in the court. I'm going to start off with a dance here in just a second. But by the time you get into the church, then the harpsichord was used in addition to the organ in the church to assist the cantatas. And we'll talk about that in a second. So I'm going to start off with just a very, very short dance. And I wanted to talk, in doing this, about the various styles of harpsichord. So every country had its own style. We can easily identify, just an example, French Impressionist paintings. They stand out. They're completely different from German Romantic things, or what was going on in the United States. Same thing true, even more so, of music in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, until it started to get more amalgamated in the 20th. But until then, it's very distinctive. So there's 4 main kinds of harpsichord building techniques. One is, the most common is the Flemish, which of course included Belgium and Holland. And then the next most common is the English virginal, and it was specific just to England. It wasn't used anywhere else on the continent. And whereas Flemish harpsichords did tend to travel around a little bit, not so for English original. Then there's the German harpsichord style, there's the French harpsichord style, and there's an Italian harpsichord style. Each of them are completely different, and they were used in different ways. So I'll be talking about that a little bit as we go, but I'm going to start off with giving you a piece of Flemish music. So it's an anonymous composer, we don't know who it is. It's from a manuscript called the Comparison manuscript, which is Dutch. So the music is from approximately 1600, and it's a dance. So there's plenty of room if you want to try it out to test my theory that it's dance music. It's very short. So lots of times dances were in pairs. This one is an allemande followed by a galliard. So the galliard's in 3, goes back and forth between 3 and 2. And the allemande is slower, not super slow, but they have a different feel, as you'll soon hear. And then I'll talk a little bit about this instrument specifically. All right, here goes. So these dances would have been very stylized and very set as to how long they're supposed to be. And as you probably know from history books, if you were upper classes, you were expected to learn how to dance. You were also expected to be able to play an instrument, by the way. That was considered normative for people in the upper class, although they were entertained by professionals that they employed. The expectation was that you were versed in music. Henry VIII, by the way, was a composer in addition to being who he was. Yeah, right. In addition to starting the Anglican Church. And in fact, he composed, it's thought that he composed Greensleeves. We don't know that for sure. But all right, so I wanted to explain a little bit about harpsichords. Anybody want to tell me just quickly what's the difference between a harpsichord and an organ? Just anything at all, other than, well, anything. Obvious?
Harpsichord has strings and organ doesn't.
Harpsichord has strings, organ doesn't. What does the organ have instead?
Air.
So it's the difference between a wind instrument and a string instrument is either bowed, like a violin, but this one obviously is not bowed, it's struck. So it's actually not struck the way a piano is struck, where the string, a hammer comes up and hits the string. It's plucked. It has a little, it's called a plectra that sits under the string, and it literally plucks the string as it comes through. So I'll show you what this looks like. Inside here, we have what's called the jack, and the jack is this piece, and it sits. You can't quite see, but it used to be a quill This is actually made of Velcro, and it sits underneath the string, and as I push the key, this moves up, and this little thing plucks the string, and then when it comes down, it's on a spring, and it actually can pop back. So it doesn't pluck the string as it comes back down. And then this little red thing on top is called the damper that stops the sound. So it's an extremely simple mechanism. But as you can imagine, also it's very delicate. This instrument that you have is built by Ron Haas in 1979, who happened to be here in the Bay Area. And it's interesting because he modeled it, I'm sure this was intentional, he modeled it after a harpsichord builder named Haas. So there's a Hieronymus Haas, who happened to build the largest harpsichord in known existence up until the 20th century. And he was based in Germany. Actually, he was known by Johann Sebastian Bach. And the Hieronymus Bosch built a harpsichord with 3 keyboards or 3 manuals, but there's only one in the world, and that happens to be one that he built. This harpsichord is unusual because it has what's known as 3 unison stops or 3 8-foot stops. So when we talk about harpsichords, like when we talk about organs, we talk about the length of the lowest note. So in the case of an organ, the length of the lowest note when it's a singing pitch happens to be 8 feet long. That is known as the singing tone. So it's 8 foot is here. This is middle C. But if I pull out a 4-foot stop, it's half as long. It's an octave higher. It would play. The sound would be here if I played the same note. So this instrument happens to have 3 sets of 8-foot strings. So that means it has 3 unison sounds. I'll play them one at a time so you can hear what it sounds like. Here's one set. Here's another set. Here's another set. And then here's 2 together. And then here's 3 together. So that's unusual. It's the only harpsichord I actually know, literally, that has ever done this. And I was talking to the person who maintains this, Arthur Omura, and he said it's the only harpsichord he's ever seen also that has 3 of those sets of strings. So it just gives it a little bit more beef into the room, so it can project a little bit better. This instrument also has, I was talking about that 8-foot and 4-foot thing. It does have a set of an octave higher. So here's just the 3 8s. Here's adding the 4-foot. So it's as if I'm playing 2 octaves simultaneously. That's a unique thing to a lot of harpsichords. Of course, organs do this too. What that does is it creates the sound to carry a little bit further. It doesn't really change the volume appreciably. So the organ and the harpsichord had a similar purpose initially. The organ made for leading congregational singing, the harpsichord for enhancing the context of an ensemble. Before harpsichords were really used much as solo instruments, they had a function in the ensemble with a small orchestra or a chamber orchestra. And the role was to play along continuously. So we use a word now to describe that kind of music. We say it's a basso continuo, meaning it's based in the bass note and it's continuo or continuous. So the harpsichord is always filling out the harmonies. If you look at a harpsichord piece of music all the way through the 18th century that's intended to be with orchestra, then you only typically see a bass note and a number. So this is called figured bass, and it's up to the player to improvise based on the context of the music and the number of players that were playing and the style of the music to improvise the extra chords. Typically, it's just simple chord progressions. Kind of thing, that you're not actually filling in much, but often it becomes a little bit more embellished depending on the skill of the player and what's called for in the music. So I'm going to give you an example now of a piece. Here's a piece by Johann Sebastian Bach that is that shows off another sound that's unique to harpsichords, and it's known as the buff stop, and it's usually called the lute stop. It's called the lute stop because it sounds like a lute. So here's the upper manual 8-foot, and with the buff stop added, it sounds like this. Sorry. So it's like it's being plucked, as opposed to, you know the difference? So a lot of composers would do solo pieces where they expected the keyboard player to play around with this particular sound. So I'm going to give you, this is a sarabande from a French suite Bach, and it demonstrates how beautiful this lute stop is here. It's simple, but it gives it this incredible sense of gracefulness when you hear it in that kind of a context with this buff stop. Okay, so you've heard some German music now. You've heard some Flemish music, so I wanted to ask you if you can think of why would a composer like Bach, since it's a German instrument and Bach knew the predecessor of this instrument. Why would a composer like Bach have several harpsichords at home?
Different keys.
That's a good guess. Different keys. This one can actually transpose. We'll talk about that in a second, but that's a good point. Anything else? Different kinds of harpsichords? Possibly, probably not, but maybe. It's not a bad guess. Well, let me ask you this: if you wanted to practice the organ, what did he have to do? Anybody ever think about this?
Get somebody to pump the organ.
He had to get somebody to pump the organ, and guess who pays for that? The church or the organist? There you go, the organist. The organist paid for the organ pumpers, and guess how they were paid? Anybody know? They're paid in beer. That was the payment to be an organ pumper. That was the original version of the Stairmaster. You know, actually, some of these you pump literally with your feet, so it literally is like a Stairmaster.
So did they pump slower towards the end of the?
I don't know. There must be stories about that I just don't know about.
I don't think they drank the beer while they were pumping.
Oh, they drank during the sermon.
You did?
Yeah, the church cellar had beer, and then when it came time for them to come back, the organist had this knob on it. It was called the calcant, and it would ring the bell, like come up, and it's time to come back, and anyway, that's another story. So, all of which is to say that it's impractical to be able to practice on an organ. You basically only use the organ just before you're about to perform to make sure that you knew what you were doing. And you practice, you learn the music on a harpsichord at home. It was also warmer. The church would have been freezing cold, except for maybe 4 months out of the year. And so it had its practical purposes to study, to have these things on harpsichord. Some harpsichords actually have pedals, just like an organ with pedals underneath, so you could practice pedal parts. We actually think some of the music that Bach wrote was specific, like the Jig Fugue, was probably specific to being played on the harpsichord, the pedal harpsichord. So that's another unique thing about it. The harpsichord, by the way, functions exactly like a piano keyboard does, in that it has a frame. It's attached to it. It's called a hitch pin at the end, and then this is the tuning, where the tuning takes place by tightening the tension on the string, exactly the same as a piano, and it is the distance from the bridge, which is usually made of a harder wood, to the plectra, where the string is plucked. That gives the length of the pipe of the string that determines the pitch. So, any questions so far?
So why did Bach have several harpsichords?
Well, he had several so that he could practice and his children could practice. Most of his children were also studying, and so it was normal. Yes.
Yeah. Harpsichords are not very loud, so if you played to a large community of dancers, their feet would probably drown out the harpsichord.
Yeah, interesting. So when you have a harpsichord in an orchestra, this sound, even without the forefoot, has a way of cutting through because of the upper partials that happen from the plucking of the string, and so you can hear sort of the percussion effect of a harpsichord, even if you can't hear the tone itself. You can hear that's why it's so useful in chamber ensembles, because it helps keep not only fill up the harmonic texture, but it helps to keep the ensemble together. And usually the harpsichordist, it was either the harpsichordist or the first violinist that led the orchestra. The days of having a conductor in front of a group came in the latter part of the 18th century. In Bach's day, that didn't happen. You didn't have somebody up there waving. Maybe occasionally to start things off, but basically the person was playing an instrument. By the way, speaking of harpsichord, I mentioned that harpsichord was used in church. That's a surprise to a lot of people. I think of a harpsichord as a chamber music instrument with secular music. Actually, all of our most of the cantatas that we have of Johann Sebastian Bach, the original manuscripts, have two keyboard parts, and they are a whole step apart. So the reason for this is because the harpsichord was tuned to the pitch of the string players, which we call kammerton, or chamber music pitch, and the organ was tuned to chorton, or choir pitch. And the organ is tuned a step higher. Anybody want to guess why? A third of the cost of the organ is in the bottom 3 notes. So you take two of those away, and you've just saved yourself a bunch of money, and building the organ. So organs in Germany are typically a half step, sometimes a whole step, sometimes a minor third, higher than what we consider normal pitch today. Typically, the pitch used in the Baroque period, we think, was a half step lower than our modern pitch. So modern pitch is a 440 hertz per second on this pitch, and the harpsichords and the chamber music of the day was 415, which is 1/2 step lower. So you do that. So that means the harpsichord part would be in D major, and the organ part would be in C major. So that's how we know that the harpsichord was used in church with the chamber music. Yeah, question. Yes.
Yeah, I was going back to what you first talked about, where you were adding strings. I think is when you hit one key there, is that particular thing key hitting more than one string?
Yeah, that's a good question. So each I showed you there were these jacks under here. Each string has its own set of jacks. So what happens when I'm using more than one string is, so this is 2 strings. I'm actually the same as the key travels up in the back from the pivot point. It's actually set so that it's activating several jacks simultaneously. So the string is it's only one string that's being struck for each jack. There's 4 complete sets of jacks, 3 for 8-foots and 1 for the 4-foot. Am I speaking Greek? Does that make sense?
I think I might need to look at it later.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So you can show it to me.
Yeah. It's well, you can think of it like different ranks of pipes on the organ. So the pipes you see right there, that's actually more than one rank of pipes. So you push down one note, and you're activating either one pipe itself, or maybe the one behind it and the one in front of it, and that's depending on the number of stops you have out. It works exactly the same way. Yeah. So you can actually activate more than one string just by playing one key.
But when you're activating more than one string, it's heavier to play.
Yes, it's heavier, right. And I changed that by, there's these little things up here that add the string. It literally moves the string, the jack over, so that it's now in the way of being, they all move simultaneously, but only one set of strings is in position to be plucked. Or here, now there's another set of strings that I just moved over just by moving these little gadgets up here on the top. Make sense? Okay. So I mentioned that there's all these different styles. I'm going to give you a little bit of a character of French music now. This is from a composer from the middle of the 18th century, Claude Balbas, and it has this kind of goofy name, which we actually don't even know what it refers to, called La Lugiac, and it's a little bit of a jig. But it'll give you an example of how the music sounds so different from different countries. Here goes. French harpsichord was more delicate and had a brighter sound than the German harpsichord. And so this music tends to be a little bit sweeter and kind of like a pastry, as compares to Wiener Schnitzel or something like that.
Was that a dance accompaniment?
That would have been just
An entertainment.
Entertainment purpose, yeah. Probably for the court. Yeah, exactly. Then I thought I'd give you an example of some English music. So the English version of harpsichord was not long this way. It went straight across, and it was called a virginal. I'm not sure where the derivation of that name comes from. Matthew, do you know why it's called a virginal?
It's supposedly because of Queen Elizabeth's virginity.
Ah, got it. Same reason the state of Virginia is named Virginia. Okay. So the virginal has a very strong sound. It only 1 8-foot sound. Never had more than that, and a very strong sound, and it didn't carry. As soon as you plucked it, it went ah. It just dies almost immediately. So as a consequence, the music of like William Byrd, which I'm about to demonstrate in a second, has lots of ornamentation. In order to keep the sound going, you have to just keep playing notes, or the sound dies too quickly. And it's just the nature of that instrument. So it was beefy, much like the Flemish or maybe the German instruments, but not long sustained. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a pavane of William Byrd. So William Byrd, as you probably know, is he's actually in our Anglican calendar of patron saints, along with Johann Sebastian Bach, and he's in many respects the father of Anglican music, even though he himself was not Anglican. He had a dispensation, as you may know, to remain a Catholic. Provided he didn't make too big a thing about it. And Queen Elizabeth said it was okay for him and a couple others, Tallis too, but that's a longer story. So this gives you a little example of the kind of music that the Anglican Church would have heard. I'll give you just a little bit of this pavane, and then I'll play the galliard that goes along with it. So again, the dances are in pairs. gives you a little bit of the English characters. So how would you define anything come to mind between you've heard some Flemish, you've heard some German, you've heard English, you've heard French. Any words come to mind that describe differences?
Well, they're definitely different.
They're definitely different. Good. All right. Well, I'll give you a little further afield, which is I'll give you now an example of some Italian music. So the Italian music, much like Italian cars, it's quirky, tends to be showy, and it tends to be very unexpected. And the sense of having a meter that you can move to easily and dance to goes out the window. It's all about improvisation and about sort of showing off a little bit, and like, this is me, and I'm not doing anything that you're going to anticipate in advance. So this is a piece by Frescobaldi, who is probably the most significant keyboard writer in Italy from the Baroque period, and it shows well some of the quirkiness of this Italian music. You'll see exactly what I mean in a minute. Sort of weird. You know, how would you describe it? It's just
It has chords that I don't expect.
yeah. There's nothing about it that's can be anticipated. Yeah.
It reminded me of Bohemian Rhapsody.
A Bohemian Rhapsody.
All over the
Yeah, and it goes all over the place. So, you know, I mentioned that Bach and other church organists would have worked a lot on the harpsichord. So Bach composed a lot of chorale preludes that would eventually be used as organ literature, but he composed them on the harpsichord. And I can give you, Matthew played for prelude this morning a setting of Allein Gott, All Glory Be to God on High, and which is a very common hymn tune chorale tune in Germany. I'll give you an example of one that Bach wrote. Undoubtedly wrote it on the harpsichord, but it's intended to be played on the organ. I won't play the whole thing through, but just to give you an example of how this fueled his imagination. The melody, by the way, comes in. It's only in 3 parts, and the melody comes in the middle, and you think, oh, that should be easy. See if you can find it. That's just the opening phrase. So the melody is very carefully hidden inside, but it's the Bach and all composers of his time would have mostly composed this in their head, sitting at a desk. But almost undoubtedly, they would have then walked over to the harpsichord and just played it and worked it out just to make sure what they conceived in their head was indeed going to take place and possible to play. So the harpsichord had that function of being the main tool for composers. It's interesting, actually, when you think about composition, up until about the year 1900, I would say probably 95% of all composers played the organ, and usually the harpsichord, and if it was all the way through the 18th century, or the piano if it was through the 19th century. And today, probably it's reversed. Probably maybe 5% of composers play the organ, and it's completely switched around. Why was the organ and the piano / harpsichord ubiquitous with composition?
You play multiple parts.
You're playing multiple parts, exactly. You're not, and you. So when you look at a harpsichord part, especially, it's about the vertical alignment, because it gives you only one note and a number, and then it'll say 6, and that tells you that you have to play. If you see an A and it says 6, it tells you that you have to play a first inversion of the chord. If it says 5, then it tells you you're in root position. If it tells you 4/2, then it tells you you're in an inversion, and on it goes. So each of these numbers that are going by, sometimes the speed of light, are telling the player how they're supposed to fill things in, but they're having to think vertically, and also horizontally. What's the shape of the melody? What's the shape of the phrase? So the composer had to do both in order to make compositions. Today we compose with our computers, and then the computer tells us if it works, sometimes successfully. Yes, sometimes successfully. So I thought I would end with doing a piece that playing a movement from one of Bach's Brandenburg concertos, and I chose this because this was really the first virtuosic piece ever composed for keyboard, and it's the first, to my knowledge, it's also the first piece with a written out cadenza for any player at all. And it goes back and forth between multiple functions. It has, the harpsichord part is, sometimes it's figured bass. So at the beginning, you'll hear me playing just block chords. And that's because all I have is one note and numbers underneath each note. So I'm filling in. And I make changes each time I do it. And that's part of the risk, it's part of the joy. The challenge of this kind of thing is to keeps it very much alive. And then it moves into a part that's all written out. And then it moves into a part that's extremely flashy, which you'll unmistakably hear. But before I finish up with that movement, is there anything that you wanted to ask about harpsichord, how they work?
Where did tempered scale come in the life of the harpsichord?
Which scale?
Tempered.
Oh, tempered scale. All right, so that's going into Pythagorean physics. Harpsichords were tuned in something other than what's called equal temperament. If you go to the piano and play a C major scale or a chromatic scale, the interval that is the same between each two notes, each two adjacent notes, but you can't actually find that by tuning in perfect fifths. The world isn't made to do that. So we shorten the intervals so that they're even between. That's called equal temperament. That temperament was kind of discovered, I would say, in the middle of the 18th century. Bach wrote for what's called the well-tempered clavier. You probably heard that expression before, the well-tempered clavier. It was mistakenly thought that meant he wrote for equal temperament. He didn't. He wrote for something that was a modified temperament. So the short answer to your story is we're still trying to figure out all these temperaments, and you talk to somebody about temperaments, and you've just opened a whole thing, because everybody has opinions about it, so singers don't sing in equal temperament. You sing with a raised seventh. A major third is on the high side, a minor third is on the low side. String players play the same way, but a piano doesn't have the option of changing that. And if you want to go from C major to C sharp major, then it has to all work. But harpsichords tended to be tuned in a way that they only work best in certain keys. So they were never, historically, they were never tuned in equal temperament. And so that meant they sounded really sweet in some keys and a little sour in other keys. I don't know whether this one is tuned in equal temperament or not, do you know?
It is, because we didn't know if we needed to transpose it this morning.
So he talked about transposing. There is inside of this harpsichord, this guy. It's called a cheek, and this allows the whole keyboard to be moved up by a half step. At the moment, it's just playing in Baroque pitch. So that's a 4/15, so that's what you heard this morning for the anthem. But common pitch in the modern world is a 4/40. So this harpsichord can play at either Baroque pitch or modern pitch. And that's one of the special things of transposing instruments. Yeah, are there other questions before I do some Bach, Brandenburg? Okay, all right, so this is the Brandenburg Concerto number 5, and is you'll be hearing some parts that and by the way, I see it's getting close to 12:30. feel free to get up and go if you need to, because the piece is probably about 8 minutes. So if you need to get up.
We can manage 8 minutes.
Do you mind if we film you playing a little
Oh,
piece?
No,
I should just, this is
it's-
being filmed
it's
already,
actually
and it
on.
will be on our YouTube channel by tomorrow.
Bach doesn't get any royalties, unfortunately. Yeah.
Which of the styles are you gonna play this in?
So I'm going to use 8/3/8 of sounds, just to give a little heft. So when you're hearing me play block chords, like I will at the beginning, that's when then what I have is one note with a number under it. And then when you hear more fancy stuff in the right hand, that's actually composed by Bach. So here it goes.